This week, we're discussing the efforts that have been made when it comes to preserving cultural heritage, specifically the history of U.S. legislation for cultural preservation, and work involving the recovery and/or restoration of international cultural resources. So let's start with here at home first. So nowadays we have what's called cultural resource management, otherwise known as CRM, and this involves companies that conduct activities related to compliance with the legislation we're going to talk about today that protects cultural resources. Because of this, it's sometimes referred to as compliance or corporate archaeology, and it involves identifying an area of potential effect and identifying whether any cultural resources occur within that area. Nowadays, CRM projects account for about 90% of all field archaeology that's conducted within the United States. However, this was not always the case. Going back to 1891, we have an example of a Swedish archaeologist, not a Swedish archaeologist, just a Swedish scientist, who dug extensively at Cliff Palace in what's now called Mesa Verde. This individual ended up exporting a huge collection home. It's actually now located in Finland's National Museum, rather than being here in the United States. Efforts to curb the illegal excavation and exportation of artifacts from sites like Mesa Verde began in 1902. What was called the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association, which was a women's organization at the time, raised funds to rent land on the Ute Reservation that contain these Pueblo ruins in an effort to try and help preserve them. Finally, though, in 1906, Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president, signed what's called the Antiquities Act, and this is what finally made it illegal to excavate or collect remains. Roosevelt designated Devil's Tower and Montezuma's Castle here in Arizona as the first national monuments, and Mesa Verde was actually the first national park created for its archaeological significance in particular. Later on, in 1966, we have what's called the National Historic Preservation Act, which says that it shall be the policy of the federal government to foster conditions under which our modern society and our prehistoric and historic resources can exist in productive harmony. This created what is now called the SHPO offices, or State Historic Preservation Offices, and these are individuals who work for the state government then. Because of this act, it requires that 100% pedestrian survey be conducted on all federal lands, and many archaeologists nowadays work for the Bureau of Land Management or the National Park Service to help achieve this goal. However, by the late 1990s, we still know that less than 10% of all federal lands have been actually surveyed. Section 106 of the NHPA states that if you want to build something on federal property or modify the landscape, or if you want to construct something that requires federal funding, licenses, or permits, regardless of whose property you build it on, then you must determine whether the project will adversely affect any sites included in or eligible for the National Register. And this is what has caused the uptick in CRM archaeology, because anytime you're putting in a new building or road, you have to make sure that there's no cultural resources that are going to be disturbed, or if they are, provide the opportunity for us to collect the data before it's no longer accessible. Now, the National Register, what I'm referring to is the National Register of Historic Places. And this is a listing of districts, sites, buildings, structures, and other objects that are significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. This list includes over 90,000 properties at this point. And it's important to note that word significant in its description, because according to the NPHA's regulations, significance is based on one or more of the following criteria. The first being an association with a particular event that made it important based on broad patterns of history, prehistory, or culture, or that it was associated with an important person in the past. Now, when it comes to archaeological significance in particular, What we're talking about are objects or places that possess distinctive characteristics of a school of architecture, a particular construction method, or characteristics of a high artistic value. Or it is known to contain or likely to contain data important in history or prehistory. Another important piece of legislation then is the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, or ARPA, of 1979. And this is what made it a felony to sell, receive, or transport artifacts illegally removed from federal lands. It comes with a hefty fine of $250,000 and the prospect of up to 5 years in prison, as well as the confiscation of any equipment used in the looting process. For example, petrified wood that's taken from the petrified forest, this would apply. The ARPA applies to federal land, and some states have similar laws, but unfortunately these laws do not apply to private land. So no matter how significant or remarkable a site might be, it belongs to the landowner. Now, cultural patrimony in places like Mexico and other countries is a bit different, and in those cases sometimes land can be reclaimed from an individual owner because of the significance of a fine there, but unfortunately that's not the case here in the US. The only exception to that is the discovery of human burials. And in some states, it's completely illegal to intentionally disturb a burial. And that is because of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. So this came about because in 1988, there was a survey conducted, and it was found that over 43,000 Native American skeletons were held in 163 U.S. museums. Inventories that have taken place since then actually report the number as being over 117,000 nowadays. And when we take a look at this, Indian people or Native Americans represent less than 1% of the U.S. population, but they constitute over 50% of the Smithsonian skeletal collection, and that's just wrong. I mean, these people are no different from anyone else and deserve to have their burial rights respected and returned to people who share their cultural patrimony. So what this act does is that it provides for the protection of Indian graves on federal and tribal lands, as well as prohibits the commercial sale or interstate transport of Native American bodies or body parts. This also applies to the funerary objects or other sacred objects of cultural patrimony that might have been found or are just deemed significant on their own. In order to be eligible for NAGPRA, tribes must establish cultural affiliation with the remains or artifacts that have been encountered or recovered. And this can be done in one of two ways. There's either a relationship between shared group identity, which can be reasonably traced historically or prehistorically between a present-day Indian tribe or Native American organization and an identifiable earlier group. Or it's determined that there's a preponderance of evidence based on geographical, kinship, biological, archaeological, anthropological, linguistic, folklore, oral traditional, historical, or other relevant information or expert opinion. So, taking all of that in, you are going to be working on your last activity for the semester, which deals with the case of Kennewick Man. So, in July 1996, human remains were accidentally discovered on the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. The remains were first thought to be an earlier pioneer, but radiocarbon dating revealed the body was nearly 9,000 years old. So, Native American tribes, led by the Umatilla, invoked NAGPRA, claiming geographical and cultural affiliation based on the age and location of the skeleton, and wanted to rebury him. Now, a group of archaeologists filed suit to block the repatriation of the remains, arguing that there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate that cultural affiliation. So for your assignment, I want you to read both the Native American and scientific perspectives regarding the importance or value of Kennewick Man and how his remains should be treated. There's a series of questions for you to answer, but I'm primarily interested in learning from you about what you think should be done with Kennewick Man and why. Is there some sort of fair compromise that you can come up with that takes into account both the Native American and scientific perspectives? All right, jumping quickly then to protecting international cultural resources. So this process of looting artifacts and taking them home began very early. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone actually was by a French soldier in 1799. It arrived at the British Museum in 1801 and has remained there ever since. We see other Egyptian artifacts, including this bust of Nefertiti, which is now housed in Berlin, a series of Egyptian obelisks that are found around the world. The Ishtar Gate from the ancient city of Babylon is actually housed in Berlin. And one particularly famous example is the Parthenon marbles, which are housed in the British Museum. Now, how these came to be here is a bit controversial. In 1800, a man named Lord Elgin was serving as the British ambassador to Turkey during the Ottoman Empire. So this is when Greece was actually ruled by Turkey. He removed and brought the marble statues and friezes to England, where he eventually sold them to the British Museum. Unfortunately, had a bit of bad luck and wound up dying a pauper. Since then, Greece has demanded their return, but the British Museum claims that it did nothing wrong and therefore does not have to return the British marbles. Now, that's up for debate whether or not you think these objects should be returned to their country of origin. That's something you're going to look at in the discussion for this week as well. In 1970, there was a convention by UNESCO that was signed by over 100 countries, and it was written to help curb this international trade of artifacts. You can see listed here some of the things that it banned, regulating the import and export of cultural objects, forbidding nations from illegally acquiring exported cultural objects, returning and providing restitution for cultural objects that were stolen from public institutions. Other examples of what's being done. Despite having this on the books, though, there's still this black market of antiquities that is out there. Unfortunately, a lot of terrorist groups have begun to seek out artifacts and make money for their purposes. One example of this are what's referred to as the Thieves of Baghdad. So back in 2003, the U.S. had entered and taken over the city of Baghdad. After that, unfortunately, the Baghdad Museum was left completely unguarded. Because of that, looters were able to break in, destroy all kinds of documentation. They stole over 40 items from the main galleries and 3,000 more from storage rooms. And because of that, actually, people seem to think that this was more of an inside job, that the thieves were able to be very selective. They knew exactly what they were going for, so they knew the most high-value objects to go after. Another example, since then, is a human barrier that was used to protect the Egyptian Museum in Cairo during the Arab Spring protests in 2011, putting people's bodies right between cultural heritage and those who would do it harm. Ultimately, though, the blame for these sorts of activities rests with wealthy buyers in developed nations. The United States and many other nations are working to stop the flow of illegally acquired antiquities, but there's always more that can be done, and if we can eliminate these buyers who are willing to pay these prices, then the demand for these objects would finally be eliminated.